Nobody important, just a penniless orphan we allowed to stay. Those 5 words were spoken loud enough for every man and woman in that parlor to hear, and every single one of them laughed. Everyone except him. If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel like you didn't belong in the room, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night they humiliated Clara Whitmore, the candles in the Hawthorne parlor burned so bright that every smirk on every face was perfectly visible. She noticed that detail because Clara noticed everything. It was the one advantage no one had ever thought to take from her. Her eyes, her ears, her mind working quietly behind the mask of a girl who knew when to lower her gaze and when to simply endure. She was 17 years old. She had been enduring for as long as she could remember. Hawthorne Estate sat at the edge of Harlan County, Kentucky, and on the evening of October the 3rd, 1817. It was dressed up like something out of a story about people who mattered. Edward Hawthorne had ordered fresh candles for every room, had the floors waxed until they gleamed, had the good silver polished and set out in rows that would have made a general proud. Guests had come from 3 counties over the Beaumonts, from Lexington, the Delacourts from just outside Louisville, old Judge Merritt with his second wife, who was barely older than Clara herself, and a dozen more families whose names meant something in that part of the world. Clara's name meant nothing. That had been made very clear. She moved through the parlor the way water moves around stone, carefully, quietly taking up as little space as possible. She carried the tray with both hands, kept her eyes forward, and when Mrs. Beaumont said something sharp about the temperature of the tea, Clara simply said, "Yes, ma'am, I'll see to it," and moved on. She had learned early that the fastest way through a room full of people who despised you was not to argue and not to beg. It was to be useful. To be so quietly, consistently useful that they forgot for a few hours at least that they despised you at all. The trouble was that Edward Hawthorne never forgot. He was standing near the fireplace when Clara crossed the room for the 3rd time that evening, and she felt his attention before she saw it, that particular weight of a gaze that isn't admiring, isn't curious, but is instead cataloging, measuring, finding insufficient. "Who is that girl?" asked one of the Beaumont men, not bothering to lower his voice. He was maybe 40, with the comfortable belly of a man who had never missed a meal, and he was looking at Clara the way you look at a piece of furniture that doesn't quite fit the room. Edward straightened up. There was a little half-smile on his face that Clara knew well. She braced. "Nobody important," Edward said, and the words came out smooth and easy, like he'd said them many times before, which he had. "Just a penniless orphan we allowed to stay. She makes herself useful enough, I suppose." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse than cruel, it was careless. The kind of laughter that doesn't require malice, because the person being laughed at has already been decided upon, already categorized, already filed away under, does not matter. Clara kept walking. She set the tray down on the sideboard, lifted the teapot, and filled 3 cups without spilling a drop. Her hands were not shaking. She was proud of that. She carried the cups back across the room, offered them one by one, received no thanks from anyone, and returned to the sideboard. In the window glass, she could see her own reflection. The patched dress that had been mended so many times, the original fabric was almost a minority, the hair pinned up neatly because she would not give them the satisfaction of looking untidy, the face that gave away nothing. That face had taken years to build. There was a boy in the kitchen doorway. His name was Thomas, and he was the youngest son of one of the Hawthorne stable hands, maybe 7 years old, with a thatch of dark hair and a badly cut finger he'd been nursing all evening. He'd wrapped it in a strip of cloth that was already soaked through, and he was trying very hard not to cry, because crying in the Hawthorne house had consequences he was old enough to understand. Clara saw him the moment she stepped back toward the sideboard. She changed direction without a word. "Let me see that," she said quietly, crouching down to his level. "It ain't bad," Thomas said. "I can see it's bad, honey. Don't tell me it ain't bad." She was already unwrapping the cloth with gentle hands. The cut was deep enough that she pressed her lips together for a moment, then looked up at him. "You're being very brave." "Pa says I gotta be." "Your pa's right, and you are. But being brave doesn't mean pretending it doesn't hurt." She reached into the small pocket of her apron. She kept a few things there, had for years because she had learned that prepared was better than helpless, and pulled out a clean strip of linen and a small, cork-stopped vial of witch hazel that one of the kitchen women had shown her how to make. "This is going to sting. You ready?" Thomas squeezed his eyes shut and nodded. Clara worked quickly and neatly. She cleaned the wound, pressed the cloth firm against it to slow the bleeding, then bound it up with the linen in a tight, even wrap that would hold. "There," she said. "Keep pressure on it for a bit. And next time you're near the woodpile, you mind your fingers." Thomas opened his eyes. He looked down at his hand, like he was surprised it was still attached. Then he looked up at Clara, and there was something in his face. Gratitude, yes, but also a kind of wondering, the way children look at people who seem to them impossibly competent, impossibly kind. "Thank you, miss," he said. "Go find your mama," Clara said, "and don't climb anything for a week." He scurried off through the kitchen door. Clara stood up, straightened her apron, and turned back to the room. She stopped. There was a man in the doorway she hadn't noticed before. He wasn't part of the party, or rather he was just arriving at it. He still had his coat on, the kind of heavy riding coat a man wore when he'd covered serious distance, and there was dust on his boots that no one had yet had the chance to brush away. He was maybe 30, with dark hair and the kind of face that would have been handsome if it were arranged in any expression at all, but right now it was simply still. Watching. He was watching her. Not in the way the Beaumont man had watched her, not cataloging, not measuring. Something else. Something she couldn't quite name, which was unusual, because Clara had spent 17 years learning to name things quickly. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she lowered her gaze and moved back toward the sideboard. "Nathaniel!" Edward's voice crossed the room like a man trying to cover ground he wasn't sure was still solid. Clara, arranging cups, heard the strain in it. Edward Hawthorne was not a man who was often uncertain, but he was uncertain now. "Edward?" The newcomer's voice was low and even, and didn't carry any of the performance that most men's voices carried in rooms like this. "I apologize for the hour. The road from Lexington was worse than I expected." "Not at all, not at all. Come in, come in. Let me introduce you to—" "In a moment." Nathaniel Caldwell. Clara didn't know his name yet, but she would learn it hadn't moved from where he stood. His eyes were still on the spot near the kitchen doorway, where Clara had been crouching over Thomas's hand 30 seconds ago. "Who is she?" The room went a little quiet. Not silent, there were still a dozen conversations happening, but the cluster nearest to Edward and his guest seemed to pause, the way conversations pause when something interesting might be about to happen. "Who?" Edward turned, following the look. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Oh, no one. That's just the orphan girl, Clara. She helps in the house." Nathaniel looked at Edward for a moment. Then he looked back at Clara. "Interesting," he said, and his voice was perfectly level, perfectly quiet, but it carried in the half-silence of that cluster of people. "She seems to be the only person in this room acting like someone." Clara's hands went still on the teacups. She did not look up, but she heard it, every word of it, and something inside her chest, something that had been very carefully and deliberately folded up small for a very long time, moved. Edward laughed. It was the laugh of a man who wants to dismiss something, but isn't entirely sure he's succeeding. "She's a servant, Nathaniel, a charity case." Nathaniel didn't argue. He simply moved into the room and accepted the glass of bourbon that materialized in his hand, and the conversation around him shifted back to its usual currents. But Clara, without looking up, was aware that his attention had not entirely left her. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She went and got more tea. The evening wore on, the way. Evenings in large houses wear on slowly for the people serving, and quickly for the people being served, which is one of the fundamental unfairnesses of such gatherings that no one with a full glass ever seems to notice. Clara noticed. She was crossing back from the sideboard, a fresh tray in hand, when it happened. Mr. Beaumont, the one who had asked who she was, the one with the comfortable belly, stepped back from his conversation at exactly the wrong moment, or perhaps exactly the right moment, depending on whether you were him or Clara. His elbow caught her tray. The glass of water on the corner of it went over, and it went over directly onto the skirt of Clara's dress, a skirt that had been mended 6 times in the last 2 years and could not bear much more. The cold water hit her like a slap. There was a second of surprised silence. Then Beaumont laughed. "Clumsy thing." "I'm sorry, sir," Clara said, because those were the words, the ones she had trained herself to say, the ones that kept the evening smooth, and the consequences small. But before she could move to address the mess, Edward was there. He had come across the room with the specific energy of a man who saw an opportunity. "Clara." His voice was pleasant in the way knives are occasionally pleasant, clean and sharp, and designed to go in. "Clean it up. And do try to be more careful. People like you." He smiled at the room, inviting them into the joke, "should be grateful for what they're given, particularly when they're as useless as you've been this evening." The room's laughter was softer this time, less careless, more deliberate. Clara set the tray down carefully. She crouched, reached for the dropped cloth, and began to deal with the water on the floor. Her hands were not shaking. She was still proud of that. What she was not proud of, what she would never let anyone see, was the thing happening in the center of her chest. A tight, hot, airless thing that had no name she wanted to give it, because naming it would make it real, and if it was real, she might not be able to keep it folded. "That's enough, Edward." The voice was low. It wasn't loud. But it stopped the room the way a gunshot stops a room, not because of the sound, but because of what follows the sound. Clara looked up. Nathaniel Caldwell had set down his glass of bourbon. He was looking at Edward with an expression that Clara could not immediately categorize, which was, again, unusual. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something cooler than anger. Something that had decided something. "I beg your pardon," Edward said. "She was doing her job," Nathaniel said. Beaumont's elbow caught the tray. "I watched it happen. Now you're making her clean it and calling her useless in front of your guests." He paused just for a moment. "I'll ask again, is that the kind of man you are?" The silence was absolute. Edward's face went through several changes very quickly. Clara watched them surprise offense calculation and then the careful rearrangement into something that could be read as lightness. "It's just a bit of fun, Nathaniel. The girl doesn't mind. Do you, Clara?" Clara said nothing. "Clara," Edward said, and now there was an edge in it. "No, sir," she said. "I don't mind." It was the right answer. It was the answer that kept the peace, and kept her here in this house, in this county, with the small life she had built from nothing. She knew it was the right answer. She hated it. Later, much later, when the guests had drifted into the dining room, and the parlor had gone quiet enough to breathe in, Clara gathered the last of the cups and stood for a moment in the near dark. She heard footsteps. "Miss Clara?" She turned. Nathaniel Caldwell stood at the edge of the room. He had a candle in one hand, which struck her as slightly absurd, a man of his obvious standing, holding his own candle as if he'd simply picked it up because it was there. "Sir," she said and moved to go. "I wanted to apologize." She stopped. "For what happened earlier. Edward's behavior." Clara studied him for a moment. He had the kind of face that was harder to read than most, but she had spent 17 years reading rooms full of difficult faces. She saw no performance in it, no condescension, just a man who appeared to mean what he said. "It wasn't your doing, sir," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I could have stopped it sooner." "You stopped it. Not soon enough." He paused. "How long have you been here, in this house?" Clara considered the question. It was the kind of question that could be casual or could be something else, and she had learned to determine which before answering. "Since I was 6 years old," she said finally. "And before that, I don't remember much before that." It was true, or mostly true. There were flashes, a woman's voice, the smell of something warm, a room with blue curtains, but they were the kind of memories that came apart when you pressed them, and she had stopped pressing them a long time ago. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment in a way that made her feel oddly not examined, but considered, as if there was a difference. "Good night, Miss Clara," he said. "Good night, sir," she said. She walked back to the kitchen, her wet skirt cold against her legs, and she did not let herself think about that conversation until she was alone in the small room off the kitchen that was entirely hers, with the door shut and the single candle lit. Then she sat on the edge of her cot, and she put her face in her hands, and she breathed. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since she was 8 years old, when she had decided, with the clear-eyed practical logic of a child who has no one coming to rescue her, that tears cost more than they returned. But she sat in the dark for a long time, and she thought about a man who had picked up his own candle and apologized for something that wasn't his fault. She thought about the way he'd said, "She seems to be the only person in this room acting like someone." She had spent 11 years in that house being told she was no one. She had never heard the opposite stated so plainly, by a man who had no reason to say it. She didn't know what to do with it. She folded it up carefully, the way she folded everything. The small kindnesses, the moments of dignity, the evidence that the world was not entirely made of people like Edward Hawthorne, and she put it somewhere safe. Then she blew out the candle and lay down in the dark. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she would wake before 5, and she would build the kitchen fire, and she would be useful, and she would be invisible, and she would be careful. Tonight, just for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the edges of something she couldn't name, something that felt almost dangerously like the beginning of something. She did not sleep well, not because of the cold, although the cold in that small room could be considerable in October. Not because of the damp skirt she'd hung to dry on the peg by the window. Not even because of the laughter she could still hear faintly if she tried threading up through the floorboards from the dining room below. She didn't sleep because she was thinking about a name. Clara Evelyn Whitmore. She had seen it once 3 years ago on a piece of paper she was never meant to see. She had been cleaning Edward's study, a task she was given irregularly, and only when the regular housekeeper was ill, because Edward did not like her in that room, which had always told her something, and a letter had fallen from the desk to the floor, and when she picked it up, she had seen the name before. She understood what she was reading. She had put it back exactly where it had been. Exactly. She was very precise about things like that. But the name had stayed with her. Clara Evelyn Whitmore. She had turned it over in her mind many times since then, in the same way you turn over a stone, to see what's underneath, carefully, cautiously ready to put it back if what you found was something that bit. She was Clara. That much she had always known. But she had never had a last name. Edward called her Clara. The kitchen staff called her Miss, or Girl, or sometimes Clara. Dear, the last being old Hannah's word, and spoken with a warmth that Clara stored like firewood. She had no family name, no history, no origin that anyone had ever seen fit to share with her. She had arrived at this house at 6 years old and had been told she was an orphan and should be grateful, and she had spent 11 years trying to be both those things as convincingly as she could manage. But she had a last name on a piece of paper in a locked drawer in a room she wasn't supposed to enter. And now a stranger had arrived who looked at her like she was worth looking at. And Edward Hawthorne had been afraid. She had seen it. Only for a second, only a flash quickly covered, but she had spent 11 years watching Edward Hawthorne's face, and she knew every configuration of it. She knew his genuine anger and his performed anger, his real contempt and his strategic contempt, his vanity and his greed, and his occasional flickers of something that might once have been a conscience before he'd worked very hard to silence it. She had never seen him afraid of a guest before. Not until tonight. Not until Nathaniel Caldwell walked through his door. The household woke at 5 as it always did. Clara was already in the kitchen at 4:30, which was also as it always was. She had the fire going and the first pot of coffee on before old Hannah shuffled in, and Hannah looked at her with the particular expression she reserved for things she wanted to say and had decided not to. "Heard some commotion last night," Hannah said after a while. "There was a spillage," Clara said. "I heard about the spillage." Hannah paused. "I also heard about Mr. Caldwell." Clara said nothing, which was a kind of answer. Hannah was quiet for a moment, stirring the pot. Then, without looking up, "You be careful, child." "I'm always careful." "I know you are. I'm saying be more careful." Another pause. "That man Caldwell, he's not like the others that come through here. He's got serious eyes, and men with serious eyes have a way of looking until they find things." Clara kept her hands busy with the bread. "There's nothing to find." Hannah looked at her, then over her shoulder with an expression that was not doubt exactly, but was not agreement either. "You sure about that, Clara dear?" Clara pressed the dough down hard with both hands. She didn't answer. She saw Nathaniel Caldwell twice more before noon. The first time he was in the back corridor that led to the stable speaking with one of Edward's men. Clara was carrying linens and didn't stop, but she heard enough questions about the estate, about the land, about how long Edward had managed it. The kind of questions a man asks when he's interested in the answers, not just making conversation. The second time he was in the small room off the main hall that Edward used as an informal office when he didn't want to go upstairs, and he was looking at the shelves of ledgers. Clara had not been sent to clean that room. She had, however, been sent to retrieve a particular volume from the hall shelf directly outside it, and the door was open and she could not help what she saw. He was not reading the ledgers. He was looking at the spines, scanning the years, the labels, looking for something specific. She got her book and went back the way she came and told herself that it was none of her concern. She told herself that 3 more times throughout the afternoon, and each time it helped slightly less than the time before. It was late afternoon, the light going gold and tired through the windows when it happened. Clara was in the small room adjacent to the study. Not the study itself. She was not so foolish using the writing table to update the household accounts. This was a task that had fallen to her by accident 2 years ago, when the previous housekeeper had taken sick and Clara, out of sheer necessity, had simply done it herself. Edward had never commented on this arrangement, which she had taken to mean he didn't object, or he hadn't noticed. With Edward, the two were sometimes the same. She had the ledger open and was working through the previous month's figures when she stopped. She went back. She added the column again. And again. The numbers were wrong. Not wrong in the way that mistakes are wrong, a mistranscribed figure, a forgotten entry. Wrong in the way that intentions are wrong. 3 entries in the expenses column that, if you looked at them individually, seemed perfectly routine, but when you placed them against the corresponding income figures and traced them back through the purchase records she had quietly organized over the last 2 years, they dissolved. They didn't match anything real. They were fabrications. The estate was being drained. Not quickly. Not obviously. Carefully. By someone who had been doing it for a long time and had never expected anyone to trace it back. Clara sat very still. She thought, "This is not your concern." She thought, "Put the ledger away." She thought, "This is exactly the kind of thing that gets a girl like you sent away in the middle of the night with nothing." She was thinking all of these things when she heard footsteps in the hall outside the open door, and before she could close the ledger, Nathaniel Caldwell was in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her expression, which she had not had time to arrange. "Forgive me," she said immediately. "I'll go. I didn't realize." "What did you find?" She stopped. "I beg your pardon. Just now, you found something in those numbers." He wasn't accusing. His voice was the same as it had been last night, level, even with no performance in it. "What was it?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. Here it was. The moment she'd been trained to avoid. The moment where a girl without a name and without a past says something that a man with power and connections might find inconvenient, and the girl ends up worse off for having spoken. She had been here before in smaller ways. She knew how to step back from this particular edge. And yet, "Forgive me, sir," she said carefully, "but these numbers don't tell the truth." She watched his face. She watched for the shift, the decision to dismiss, to redirect, to put her back in her proper box. It didn't come. Instead, Nathaniel Caldwell crossed the room and stood beside her, and without asking permission, he looked at the ledger. He was silent for a moment, scanning the columns she had been working through. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Show me," he said. And that was the moment, though Clara didn't know it yet, that everything began to move. She showed him. She was thorough, because she could not help being thorough. It was the one skill she had developed without anyone's help or permission. This ability to trace things, to hold multiple figures in her head at once, to follow a number backward through 3 ledgers, and find where it had originally been true before someone had made it false. She walked him through it quietly, turning pages, pointing, and she did not apologize for knowing what she knew, because apologies would have made it smaller, and it was not small. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the ledger for a long moment. "How long?" he said. "From what I can trace, at least 6 years, possibly longer." "And you've known, I've suspected something was irregular for about 2 years. I only identified the specific mechanism this afternoon." He looked at her with that expression again, the one that was not examination, but consideration. The difference, she was beginning to understand, was that examination decided something in advance and looked for evidence to support it, while consideration genuinely didn't know yet. "Who have you told?" he asked. "No one." "Why not?" The question landed plainly without judgment, and Clara found she wanted to answer it honestly, which was itself unusual. "Because," she said, "a girl with no name and no history who was permitted to stay in this house out of charity does not make accusations against the man who permitted her. Not without consequences, she can't survive." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "What's your name?" he asked. "Not what do they call you, not who are you, your name." "Clara," she said. "Just Clara." He looked at her for a beat longer than necessary. Something moved across his face, not quite recognition, but something adjacent to it. Something that had brushed against a piece of information it hadn't quite caught yet. "Just Clara," he repeated very quietly. "Yes, sir." He stood. He straightened his coat. He looked at the ledger once more, and then he looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that she would think about later in the dark, trying to name it. "Don't touch these again tonight," he said. "Leave them exactly as they are." "Yes, sir?" He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Clara," he said without turning around, "what you just showed me took intelligence and courage. Don't let anyone in this house tell you otherwise." He left. Clara sat alone at the writing table in the amber afternoon light. Her hands resting on the ledger were completely still, but inside her chest, the thing that had no name was moving again, and this time she didn't fold it away. She let it breathe. That night, after the last lamp in the main house was extinguished and the hall had gone quiet, Clara lay in her narrow cot and stared at the ceiling. She thought about numbers. She thought about 6 years of slow theft, invisible to everyone, because no one had ever expected the girl in the patched dress to be looking. She thought about Clara Evelyn Whitmore on a piece of paper in a locked drawer. She thought about the way Nathaniel Caldwell had said, "Just Clara," and the expression that had moved across his face like a cloud across a clearing. She thought about Hannah's warning. Men with serious eyes have a way of looking until they find things. She thought, whatever he finds, it will change things. She thought, whatever he finds, I am not ready. She thought, I have been not ready my entire life, and I have survived anyway. That had always been enough. She was no longer entirely certain it would continue to be. Outside her small window, October settled over the Kentucky hills, and the night was very quiet. And somewhere in Edward Hawthorne's house, a man with serious eyes was sitting with a ledger full of lies, asking himself what else might be hidden. Clara Whitmore, though she did not yet go by that name, though she did not yet stand in any room as someone with the right to use it, closed her eyes and waited for morning. Because morning always came, and because whatever Nathaniel Caldwell was going to find, he was going to find it. And for the first time in 11 years, in the very deepest place inside her, where she kept the things that were most true, Clara allowed herself to wonder. Just wonder whether being found might not be the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to her. Whether it might instead be the thing she had been quietly, stubbornly, impossibly waiting for. Morning came the way it always did, without ceremony, without kindness, without any particular regard for the people it found. Clara was at the kitchen fire before the sky had finished deciding whether it was going to be gray or blue. She had the coffee going and the bread started, and she was doing what she always did in the early hours, which was think without letting anyone see her thinking. She had not slept more than 2 hours. The ledger sat in the room down the hall, untouched exactly as Nathaniel Caldwell had told her to leave it. She had obeyed that instruction not because she was in the habit of obeying men without question. She had learned very young that blind obedience was a luxury for people who could afford its consequences, but because his instruction had made sense. Whatever he was planning to do with what she had shown him, disturbed evidence would only complicate it. She didn't know what he was planning. She didn't know enough about him yet to guess, and she was careful about guessing without enough information. Guessing wrong had costs. What she knew, he had arrived uninvited, or at least unexpectedly. Edward's face had told her that much. He had asked questions of the stable hand that were not casual questions. He had been looking at ledger spines with the particular focus of a man searching, not browsing. And he had sat across from her at a writing table in the late afternoon and said, "Show me," and meant it. She put a fresh log on the fire and told herself to be careful. Hannah shuffled in at 5, wrapped in the heavy shawl she wore from October to April, without exception, and looked at Clara over the top of it, the way she always looked at her in the morning, checking, assessing, deciding whether to say what was on her mind. This morning, she decided to say it. "He was up late," Hannah said. "Caldwell. Saw light under the study door past midnight." Clara said nothing. "Edward's study," Hannah added with the particular emphasis of a woman making sure her meaning was not missed. "The one you don't go in." Clara turned the bread. "I know which study you mean, Hannah. Just making sure you knew where that man was spending his evening." Hannah poured herself coffee with the practiced ease of a woman who had been doing it in the same kitchen for 30 years. "And you should also know that Edward came down twice. First time he knocked, second time he didn't bother." Clara's hands stilled. "What happened the second time?" "Don't know. I only heard the voices. But Edward came back up the stairs moving faster than he went down, which is saying something because Edward Hawthorne doesn't move fast for anyone." Hannah wrapped both hands around her cup. "Whatever's in that study, Clara dear, it's got both of them very interested." Clara turned back to her bread and said, "I just work here, Hannah." Hannah made a sound that was not agreement. The kitchen filled with warmth as the fire caught fully, and Clara worked through the motions of breakfast preparation with hands that knew the task well enough to do it without her full attention, which left the rest of her attention free to do what it kept trying to do, which was calculate. She was very good at calculating. The question was, what Nathaniel Caldwell had found in that study after midnight, what Edward had said when he came downstairs twice, and what the shape of the next few days was going to be. She was still calculating when the kitchen door opened and Nathaniel Caldwell walked in. Clara turned. He looked like a man who had slept perhaps as much as she had, which was to say, not very much. His coat was fresh, but his eyes had the particular quality of eyes that had been working through the night, sharp in a way that rest doesn't produce sharp in the way that urgency does. He looked at her steadily. "Good morning, Miss Clara." "Good morning, sir." She kept her voice even. "Coffee." "Please." She poured it. He took it and didn't move toward the door, which told her something. Men like Edward Hawthorne never stayed in the kitchen unless they were enforcing something. Men like Nathaniel Caldwell. She was still determining what kind of man he was, apparently sometimes stayed because they had something to say. He said it. I need you to tell me something, and I need you to tell me honestly, even if honesty feels dangerous. Can you do that? Clara looked at him over the edge of her own cup. That depends on the question, sir. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more like respect. Fair enough. The question is this, those irregularities you found in the accounts. How far back did you trace them specifically? 6 years with certainty, she said. Possibly 7. There are older ledgers I haven't been able to access. Why not? They're kept in the locked cabinet in the study. She paused. The study I'm not permitted to enter. He looked at her steadily for a moment. And have you ever in 11 years seen any documentation in this house that referred to previous ownership of this estate? Any names, any correspondence, any legal papers? The kitchen was very quiet. Clara felt something happen in her chest that she didn't immediately name. Not quite fear, not quite hope. Something in between, something with teeth. Once, she said. 3 years ago, a letter that fell from the desk. I didn't read it fully. But you read part of it. I saw a name. What name? She set her cup down. She folded her hands in front of her, which was something she did when she needed to be steady. Whitmore, she said. Nathaniel Caldwell didn't move. But something happened behind his eyes. A rapid, precise movement of thought, the kind of movement that happens when a piece falls into place. Whitmore, he repeated very quietly. Yes, sir. He set his coffee cup down on the counter. He looked at the kitchen door. He looked back at her. Don't go far today, he said. I may need to speak with you again. And he left moving with the quiet, purposeful speed of a man who had just been given something he'd been looking for. Clara stood in the kitchen. Hannah, who had been very carefully not looking at any of this from her position near the bread shelf, turned around. I told you, Hannah said. You told me to be careful, Clara said. And are you being careful? Clara picked up her bread dough. No, she said. I don't think I am. Hannah nodded slowly. No, I didn't think so either. The kitchen filled with the smell of bread and coffee and wood smoke, and neither of them said anything else, and the morning moved forward the way mornings do when something underneath them is already shifting. Edward Hawthorne came down to breakfast an hour later. Clara knew his moods the way a sailor knows weather, not by looking directly at the sky, but by reading everything around it, the way the air felt the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, the particular quality of his silences. This morning the footsteps were too deliberate, too controlled. The silence at breakfast was the kind of silence that was working very hard at being a silence. He was frightened. He was hiding it well, but she had 11 years of practice at reading him, and she knew. He ate his breakfast with mechanical precision and spoke twice, once to ask about the day's post, and once to tell the stable hand that he would not be needing the horses until afternoon. And both times his voice was steady. And both times Clara, serving quietly at the sideboard, caught the fractional pause before the words came that told her they were being chosen with unusual care. After breakfast he went to the study. Nathaniel did not come down until mid-morning. When he did not go to the study. He went to the library, which was adjacent to it, separated by a wall and by the kind of thin interior door that in houses like this was decorative rather than functional, and transmitted voices with moderate efficiency if you happened to be standing near it. Clara was not standing near it. She had no reason to be standing near it. She was dusting the library shelves, which was a task she had been assigned to do today, which she had been assigned to do on this particular Thursday for the last 2 years, which meant her presence in that room was entirely routine and above suspicion. She was dusting the shelf nearest the interior door when Edward's voice came through it. You're wasting your time, Nathaniel. I've been told that before. Nathaniel's voice was calm. I don't find it persuasive. There's nothing irregular about the management of this estate. I've run it for 11 years without complaint. You've run it for 11 years without examination, Nathaniel said. Those aren't the same thing. A pause. Clara moved the duster very slowly, very quietly. What exactly are you implying? Edward's voice had changed, register lower, more careful, the voice he used when he was deciding how much he could afford to threaten. I'm not implying anything. I'm saying that the accounts for this estate show consistent irregularities going back at least 6 years, and I intend to understand them fully before I leave. You have no authority here. I have the authority of the bank in Lexington that holds the note on this property, Nathaniel said, and his voice was still perfectly even, perfectly calm, in the way of a man who has said something precisely because it is the most dangerous thing in the room, and he wants it to land clearly. And I have the authority of certain legal matters I'm not yet at liberty to discuss, and I have frankly my own considerable interest in seeing that this situation is resolved properly. A beat. Now, I'd like to look at the ledgers from 1810 through 1814, which I believe are in the locked cabinet. Those are private records. Edward. Nathaniel's voice was the voice of a man who had finished being patient and wanted the other person to understand that without requiring him to demonstrate it. The cabinet, if you please. Silence. Clara held her breath. She heard the sound of a key. She moved to a different shelf and kept dusting. Her hands were not shaking. She was beginning to think that was less about courage and more about the fact that her body had learned over 17 years to perform composure as a survival mechanism, even when the inside of her was doing something entirely different. The inside of her right now was doing something she couldn't name. The word Whitmore kept moving through it, slow and deliberate as a river. Edward left the study just before noon. Clara heard his footsteps in the hall faster than usual and going toward the back of the house, toward the room where he kept his personal correspondence, and she finished her dusting and gathered her things and went back toward the kitchen, because the kitchen was where she belonged, and because removing herself from proximity to things she wasn't supposed to know was a habit so deeply worn into her that it was practically instinct. She was halfway down the hall when she nearly collided with a man she didn't recognize. He was older, maybe 60, with a weathered face and the careful, upright posture of a man who was accustomed to being in rooms where precision mattered. He was carrying a leather satchel, and he was looking at the numbers above the door frames as if comparing them to a list he had memorized. He looked at Clara, and she looked at him. "Pardon me, miss," he said, with the particular courtesy of a man who extended it to everyone as a matter of professional habit. "I'm looking for Mr. Caldwell. I was told he's in the library." "Yes, sir," Clara said. "Straight down the hall, last door on the left." "Thank you." He moved to go, then paused. "Forgive me, are you a member of the household staff?" "I am, sir." He studied her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't categorize, something careful, something that had just been startled into attention. "How long have you been in service here?" 11 years, sir." "And before that?" Clara felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. "I was brought here when I was 6 years old," she said. "As an orphan." The man looked at her for 3 full seconds. "I see," he said very quietly. And then, "Thank you, miss." And he went toward the library. Clara stood in the hall and breathed. She turned and walked to the kitchen, and she set her dusting things down with extreme care, and she stood at the counter with both hands flat on it, and she thought, who was that man? Hannah was slicing vegetables. She didn't look up. "Someone came in from town about an hour ago," she said conversationally. "Arrived in a hired coach, man by himself, leather bag. Went straight to find Caldwell." "I know," Clara said. "I just met him in the hall." "He say anything?" Clara stared at the counter. "He asked how long I'd been in the house." Hannah's knife paused. "Why would he ask that?" Hannah said. "I don't know." But she thought she might. The thought was forming the way ice forms slowly. At first, then all at once. And once it had formed, it was a different substance entirely from what had been there before. She was thinking about a locked cabinet and ledgers going back to 1810. She was thinking about a letter with a name on it. She was thinking about the fact that Edward Hawthorne, a man who had never in 11 years shown a moment of genuine care for her existence, had nevertheless kept her close, had allowed her to stay, had never not once suggested she should be sent somewhere else, or given away, or simply turned out the way people like her were. Sometimes simply turned out. She had always thought that was because she was useful. She was beginning to wonder if it was because she was valuable in a different way. Not to Edward, not as herself, but as something he needed to keep visible, needed to keep controllable, needed to know exactly where she was. She thought people hide things that matter. She thought, I have been in this house for 11 years. And then the most frightening thought, the one she had been circling for 3 years, and had never let herself approach directly. What if I was never an orphan? What if orphan was simply the story he told? She pressed her palms harder against the counter. Clara. Hannah had put down the knife. She was looking at her with the direct, clear-eyed attention of a woman who loved her and was afraid for her. What are you thinking? I don't know yet, Clara said. When you do know, I'll be careful. I wasn't going to say that, Hannah said. I was going to say when you do know, don't let him see that you know. Not until you're sure. Not until someone else is sure with you. Clara looked at her. Hannah looked back. That Caldwell man, she said. He's got a serious look, but it ain't a cruel look. And in my experience, that's a rarer combination than most people think. Clara was quiet for a long moment. You think I can trust him? I think, Hannah said, picking up her knife again, that trust is built one small thing at a time, and so far he's done 2 small things right. That ain't enough to be certain, but it's enough to take the next step. Clara nodded slowly. She picked up her apron and retied it. She straightened her collar. She did the small things that composed, that gathered, that reminded her body what its face was supposed to be doing. And then she went back to work. She was carrying a tray of afternoon coffee to the sitting room when she heard them in the library. Not Nathaniel and the stranger this time, but Nathaniel and Edward. And the conversation had moved past careful into something rawer and faster, and her footsteps slowed without her deciding they should. Want to know where you're getting your information? Edward's voice stripped now of its social finish. Just the anger underneath. I told you where I'm getting it. Nathaniel. Still even, but with an edge in it now, not anger, something harder than anger. Certainty. From your own records. Those records are remarkably clear, Edward, once you know what you're looking for. A pause, and when Nathaniel spoke again, there was something in his voice she hadn't heard there before. Something cold and decisive and final. I know about the Whitmore estate. I know about the guardianship agreement. I know about the transfer of management in 1806, and I know that transfer was contingent on conditions you have not met. Silence. A silence so complete that Clara could hear her own blood. And Nathaniel said, I know about the child. Edward's voice, when it came, had gone very quiet. You don't know anything. Then tell me I'm wrong. Nathaniel's voice was very quiet too now. 2 men in a room speaking at the volume of things that matter. Tell me there was no child. Tell me you did not take her in not out of charity, but because you were legally obligated to, and that you have spent 11 years ensuring that she had no knowledge of what she actually is, so that by the time she reached adulthood, she would have no foundation from which to claim it. Clara's tray was shaking. She gripped it with both hands and held it very still. She's a servant girl, Edward said. Whatever stories you've been told, I was told nothing. I read. There's a difference. Nathaniel's voice. And then, where is the birth record? There is no. Edward. Quiet. Absolute. The birth record. Another silence. This one different from the others, the silence of a man making a calculation and finding that all the numbers have gone against him. Clara stood in the hall with a tray of coffee cups that had stopped rattling only because she was holding on with everything she had. She was cold everywhere. She was thinking with a clarity so sharp it felt like it was cutting her. The child. He had said the child. And Edward had not said there was no child. He had said, "She's a servant girl," which was not the same denial at all, which was the kind of statement that's built to deflect rather than refute. She had been doing figures in her head since she was old enough to do figures. She had been tracing things back through records and ledgers for 2 years. She had seen a name on a letter. And now, a man with serious eyes was in a room 11 feet away from her saying, "I know about the child," to a man whose face she had watched go frightened 2 days ago at the sight of him. She made herself take one breath, then another. Then she turned around, walked back to the kitchen, set the tray down on the counter without making a sound, and stood there. Hannah looked up. Clara said very quietly, "Hannah, my mother. Did you know her?" Hannah put down the knife. And in the pause before she answered, in the particular quality of that pause, the weight of it, the way it seemed to cost something, Clara had her answer before the words came. "I knew of her," Hannah said. "Careful, gentle. The way you're careful and gentle when you're delivering something that will change the shape of everything. I wasn't in this house then, I came after. But yes, child, I knew of her." Clara's hands were flat on the counter again. "Was her name Whitmore?" Hannah closed her eyes. "Yes," she said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the October afternoon was going gold, and somewhere in the house, a man named Nathaniel Caldwell was looking at 11 years of carefully constructed lies, and somewhere at the back of the house, a man named Edward Hawthorne was realizing that the walls he had built were beginning to come apart at their joints. And in the kitchen, a girl named Clara, a girl with no last name, a girl who had been called a penniless nobody by everyone who had ever looked at her, stood with both hands flat on the counter and breathed. She breathed through the shaking. She breathed through the thing in her chest that had no name and was now very large. She breathed through the tears that rose once, and that she pressed back down with the practiced, ruthless efficiency of a woman who had decided at age 8 that tears cost too much. She breathed. And then she lifted her hands from the counter, and she turned around, and she looked at Hannah with the clearest eyes she had. "I need you to tell me everything you know," she said. "Everything. Not what you think I can handle. Everything." Hannah looked at her for a long moment. Then she pulled out a chair. "Sit down, Clara dear," she said. And Clara sat down, and Hannah began to talk. She talked about a woman named Margaret Whitmore, who had died young in the winter of 1806 of a fever that came on fast and left nothing. She talked about a husband who had gone before her a year earlier from a riding accident, and an estate that had been left to their only child with Edward Hawthorne, named as temporary guardian until the child came of age. She talked about a guardianship agreement that stipulated care and education and the preservation of the estate's assets. She talked about what happened instead. She talked about what happened to children when the adults responsible for them decided that the children's interests and their own were not the same thing. Clara listened to every word. She didn't cry. But when Hannah finished, there was a long silence. And in that silence, Clara felt the entire architecture of her understanding shift. Not crumble, not collapse, but shift, realign, reorder itself around a center point that had always been there, and that she had somehow never been allowed to see directly. She had not been taken in. She had been kept. There was a difference. The difference was enormous. The difference was everything. She was still sitting with that difference, still feeling the weight and the shape of it, when footsteps sounded in the hall and a knock came at the kitchen doorframe, and she looked up to find Nathaniel Caldwell standing there. He looked at her face. Whatever he saw there, it told him something. Because his expression shifted in a way, she was beginning to recognize that movement behind the eyes, that rapid recalibration. "You heard," he said, "not a question." "Some of it," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at Hannah, who looked back at him with the unflinching directness of a woman who had been in too many difficult rooms to be impressed by difficulty. Then he looked back at Clara. "I need you to understand something," he said, "and I need you to hear it the way I mean it, not the way fear might make it sound." He paused. "What I've found, what I'm finding, it's real. The records exist. The original documents exist. The witnesses exist. This is not a small thing I stumbled onto, and it is not something Edward can make disappear by morning. Another pause. You are not a nobody. You were never a nobody. You were a child they chose not to see because seeing you was inconvenient. Clara looked at him. She thought about 17 years of lowered eyes and quiet hands, and the careful, exhausting work of being invisible enough to be safe. She thought about a name on a letter. She thought about her mother, a woman she didn't remember, with a name that had been kept from her, like a theft. She said, "What happens now?" And Nathaniel Caldwell said, "Now we find out everything, all of it. No more guessing, no more fragments. We find out what's true, and we put it in front of people who can act on it. And we do it before Edward understands that we already have enough." Clara stood up from the chair. She straightened her collar the way she always did, the small habitual gesture of composure, of gathering herself, of deciding what her face was going to be. But this time, it felt different. This time it felt less like defense and more like preparation. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Nathaniel looked at her. That look that was consideration, not examination, and said, "I need you to remember everything. Every detail you've seen in this house in 11 years. Every document, every name, every conversation you weren't supposed to overhear." He held her gaze. "You've been watching this place for a decade. I suspect you know more than you've told anyone." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where do you want to start?" And something crossed his face that she hadn't seen there yet. Not quite a smile, warmer than that. Something that looked, despite everything, like relief. "The beginning," he said. "Tell me everything from the beginning." And so she did. She talked for 2 hours. She talked about the locked cabinet and the older ledgers and the name on the letter and the specific columns in the accounts where the numbers stopped being true. She talked about Edward's trips to Lexington, which happened with a regularity she had never understood until now. She talked about a land deed she had glimpsed once briefly that referred to property boundaries she had never seen reflected in any conversation about the estate's current holdings. She talked about small things and large things, and the connective tissue between them that she had been carrying in her memory for years, without knowing why, without knowing what it was for. Nathaniel listened. He asked questions. He wrote things down with the focused intensity of a man constructing something, building it piece by piece toward a shape that was becoming clearer with every piece she added. Outside, the afternoon moved toward evening. Edward Hawthorne moved through his house with the careful quietness of a man who was thinking very fast and not allowing anyone to see it. Hannah made supper and pretended not to listen, and in the library, at the long table by the window, a girl who had been called a nobody for 17 years sat across from a man who was listening to her as if every word she said was worth hearing. It was she thought, and the thought arrived quiet and precise and certain as the figures in a correct ledger, the strangest afternoon of her life. It was also, she thought, the first afternoon in 17 years that felt like it was entirely hers. She kept talking, and he kept listening, and in the locked cabinet in the room down the hall, a birth record waited in the dark, carrying a name that was hers, that had always been hers, that no one had ever been able to take even when they had taken everything else. She talked until the candles burned low. Nathaniel filled 4 pages of notes. He wrote quickly and precisely, the way a man writes when he already understands the shape of what he's hearing and is only confirming the details he'd suspected. Clara watched his hand move across the paper and thought about how strange it was, how profoundly disorienting. Strange to have someone write down the things she said as if they were worth recording. Nobody had ever written down anything she said before. When she finished, Nathaniel set his pen down and looked at the pages. He was quiet for a long moment, and she let him be quiet because she understood the kind of silence that was working, that was building something, and this was that kind. Then he looked up. "The man who came this afternoon," he said. "His name is Samuel Greer. He's a solicitor from Louisville. He handled your parents' estate originally, drew up the guardianship agreement, filed the land records, all of it." He paused. "He reached out to me 8 weeks ago. He had information he'd been carrying for a long time, and had decided he could no longer carry alone. Clara felt the word parents move through her like a cold current. Not parents as an abstraction the way orphans thought of parents as an absence, a blank, a thing that had simply not existed for them. But parents as people, specific people. A woman named Margaret, a man she didn't even have a name for yet. Why now? She asked. Why after 11 years? Because Greer is 63 years old and his health is not good, Nathaniel said plainly. And because men who carry guilty knowledge long enough sometimes reach a point where the weight of it becomes more than the fear of what happens if they set it down. He held her gaze. He knew what Edward was doing. He didn't stop it when he should have. He's here now because he wants to stop it before he dies. Clara absorbed this. She thought about guilt as a slow-moving thing, a thing that accumulates the way sediment accumulates invisible. At first, then suddenly, one day, an obstruction. She understood it intellectually. She wasn't sure yet whether she could extend anything warmer than understanding toward a man who had known for 11 years and waited until his health failed to act. "Does he know about me?" she asked. "Does he know I'm here?" "He suspected you were here. He wasn't certain." Nathaniel paused. "When he met you in the hall this afternoon, he looked at me strangely." "Because you look like your mother," Nathaniel said quietly. "He told me so himself an hour ago. He said he knew the moment he saw you." The kitchen had gone very quiet. Hannah had stopped moving somewhere behind Clara, and the fire had settled, and the whole house seemed to be holding itself still. Clara looked down at her hands. She had her mother's hands, presumably, her mother's face. She was wearing a patched dress in a house that had belonged to her family, serving people who had no right to her service, and she had a face that a guilty old solicitor had recognized in a hallway and been unable to look away from. "I want to see the birth record," she said. Nathaniel nodded. "Tomorrow morning. Greer has it with him. He'll present it formally." "And Edward." A pause. "Edward will be present." Clara looked up. "You're going to confront him?" "Yes." "In his own house?" "In what is legally still his house until the matter is formally resolved," Nathaniel said carefully. "After that, the question of whose house it is becomes considerably more straightforward." Clara was quiet. She was calculating again, not numbers this time, but something harder and less certain. She was calculating the distance between where she was now, which was a kitchen in October, with her hands in her lap, and where this conversation was pointing, which was a place she had no map for. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I've spent 11 years building a way to exist here. I know exactly what I am in this house, and exactly what I'm not, and I've made something of that knowledge, something functional, something that kept me safe. Whatever happens tomorrow, that's gone. That particular safety is gone." Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "I know. I'm not asking for reassurance," she said. "I'm telling you I understand the cost. I want you to understand that I understand it so that when I say yes, you know it's not because I don't see what I'm agreeing to." He was quiet for a moment. Then something moved in his expression, something that was not pity, which she would not have tolerated, and not admiration exactly, but something between the two. Something that looked like seeing. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She went to bed. She did not sleep. By 3 in the morning, she had stopped trying to sleep and was sitting on the edge of her cot, her hands folded in her lap, working through the same thoughts she had been working through for hours, with the methodical persistence of a woman who found thinking more reliable than hoping. By 4, she was at the kitchen fire. By 5, she had the coffee going and the bread started, and she was doing outwardly exactly what she did every morning. Because that was what you did. You did the work. You kept your hands busy. You did not let the magnitude of what was coming make you fall apart before it arrived. Hannah came in at 5, looked at her, and did not say a single word. She just poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of Clara, and drank the other herself in silence, which was, Clara thought, the most eloquent and loving thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. Edward came down at 7. He looked like a man who had also not slept. He looked? Clara thought, watching him from the corner of her attention as she moved through the breakfast service like a man who had spent the night adding up numbers and finding that they no longer worked in his favor. He ate nothing. He drank his coffee standing, which he never did, and he looked out the window with the focused absence of someone who is not seeing what they're looking at, because they're seeing something that isn't there yet, but is coming. He looked at Clara once, just briefly as she crossed to the sideboard. She kept her face exactly as it always was. He looked away first. At 8:30, Samuel Greer came downstairs. He was dressed carefully, carrying his leather satchel, and his face had the particular quality of a man who had decided something irrevocable and was now simply living inside that decision. He looked at Clara when he entered the dining room, and this time he didn't look away quickly. He said, "Good morning, Miss Whitmore." The room went absolutely still. Edward's coffee cup hit the saucer hard. Clara looked at Greer steadily. Her heart was doing something extraordinary in her chest, but her face gave nothing. "Good morning, sir," she said. Edward pushed back from the table. "What do you think you're doing, Greer?" "Addressing the young woman by her legal name," Greer said. And the old man's voice was quiet, but it was iron in the way that voices are iron when they have finally found the thing they should have said a long time ago. "Which I should have been doing for the last 11 years. I'm correcting that now. You have no standing here. I have the standing of the attorney who drafted the original guardianship agreement for the Whitmore estate in 1806, Greer said. I have the standing of the man who registered this child's birth record in Louisville on the 14th of March, 1800. And I have the standing of a man who is very tired of being complicit in something he knew was wrong." He set his satchel on the table. "Shall we sit down, Edward? I think we've all been standing long enough." Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. He looked at Clara first. She couldn't have said why that mattered, but it did, that he looked at her first before anyone else in the room checking. She gave him the slightest nod, which meant, "I'm still here." "I'm all right." He looked at Edward. "Please sit down," Nathaniel said, and it was not a request. Edward sat. The leather satchel opened, and 11 years of hidden truth began to come out into the light. Greer laid the documents on the table one at a time, with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that each one was a kind of detonation and wanted to be precise about the order. The birth record first. Clara Evelyn Whitmore, born March 14th, 1800, daughter of James Whitmore and Margaret Elaine Whitmore, née Calloway. And when Clara saw it, when she saw her own name written in ink that was 17 years old, she felt something happen in her body that she couldn't control. Her hands went to the edge of the table. She gripped it. Nathaniel, standing to her left, noticed. He didn't say anything, but he moved just slightly, just enough so that his arm was near hers without quite touching it. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of another person beside her. She let herself grip the table and kept her eyes on the paper. Her name. Her name in her mother's handwriting, Margaret Whitmore had filled out the registration herself. Greer confirmed because she had wanted to do it personally. The letters were neat and careful and very slightly forward-leaning. The handwriting of a woman who wrote with intention. Clara stared at it and thought she held a pen and wrote my name. She thought she was real. She was real, and she knew I existed, and she wrote my name down so it would be true forever. Edward said nothing. Greer placed the second document. The guardianship agreement, 12 pages dense with legal language, and even without reading every word, Clara could see the relevant terms. When Greer pointed to them, the guardian shall maintain the estate's assets in full. The guardian shall provide for the child's education and welfare. The child shall, upon reaching her majority, be presented with a full accounting of the estate, and shall assume ownership of same. And then the date, and Edward Hawthorne's signature, and below it, a promise he had never intended to keep. Edward looked at the wall. "You signed it," Nathaniel said. "Not accusatory, factual. The way you state something that is simply true. You signed it willingly in front of 2 witnesses, and you were given custody of this estate and this child on those terms." "Circumstances change," Edward started. No! Nathaniel's voice was still even, but something in it had sharpened. No, Edward. Circumstances change. People's choices change. The agreement doesn't change. It says what it says, and you knew what it said. Greer placed the third document. Clara leaned forward involuntarily. This one was different from the others, older with a quality of being handled many times, the edges soft with age. It was a letter. Her mother's handwriting again. She recognized it now from the birth record. This was written by Margaret Whitmore, approximately 3 weeks before her death, Greer said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not quite. It was addressed to me. She knew she was ill. She was afraid of what would happen. He paused. She was afraid specifically of what would happen to Clara. Clara's breath left her body. She had not known it was possible to miss someone she didn't remember. She had assumed that grief required memory, that you couldn't mourn what you didn't have. But sitting at that table with her hands gripping its edge and her mother's letter 3 feet away from her, she discovered she was wrong. The grief arrived anyway. It arrived without memory and without warning, and it was enormous. She pressed her lips together. May I read it? Her voice came out lower than she intended. It's yours, Greer said simply. It has always been yours. She picked it up. Her hands were steady. She was still proud of that, and she suspected she would continue to be proud of that for the rest of her life, because it was costing her more than anything she had ever done to keep them that way. She read, My dear Mr. Greer, I write with some urgency, as I am not well, and growing less so. I am frightened not for myself, but for my daughter. I have made arrangements I believe to be adequate, but I fear now they are not. Edward is a practical man, which I once thought was a virtue. I understand now that practical men sometimes find children inconvenient, and estates convenient, and that the distance between those two things is where harm happens. Please keep this letter. Please remember Clara's name. Please, if ever there comes a time when someone asks, please tell them the truth. She is not nobody. She has never been nobody. She is mine. She is a Whitmore. And whatever happens, that is true. Clara set the letter down. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at Edward Hawthorne, and for the first time in 11 years, for the first time in her life, she looked at him without the mask, without the performance of smallness, without the careful protective arrangement of features that said, I am no one. I am nothing. Please do not look at me too closely. She looked at him, and she let him see her looking. He flinched. It was small, just a fractional pulling back, a tightening around the eyes, but she saw it. She had made Edward Hawthorne flinch, and she had done it by doing nothing except allowing herself to be seen. She wrote that she was afraid for me, Clara said. Her voice was very quiet. She was right to be afraid. Edward's mouth opened. Don't, Nathaniel said, and his voice was not loud, but it landed in that room like a hand coming down flat on a table. Whatever you're about to say, Edward, I would think very carefully. Edward closed his mouth. Greer placed the fourth document, the land registry. Then the fifth, a banking record from the Lexington Bank that showed the first in a series of withdrawals that did not correspond to any legitimate estate expense. Then a sixth, then a seventh. With each document, the room got quieter. Not the quiet of emptiness, the quiet of weight, the quiet of a thing that has been carried for a long time and is finally being set down, and the setting down is loud in its own way. 11 years, Nathaniel said after the seventh document. 11 years of managed accounts systematically drained. The estate's current value is approximately 40% of what it was at the time of James Whitmore's death. He looked at Edward. Where did it go? Duh. Edward's jaw was tight. There were expenses. I've seen your expenses. They don't account for it. Nathaniel's voice was still even. It was the kind of even that required enormous effort to maintain, and he was maintaining it completely. Where did it go, Edward? This is you can't simply come into a man's house. I can, and I have. And now there was something in Nathaniel's voice that Clara had not heard before. Not anger, not performance, but something that was simply done with pretending this conversation had two equal sides. You have been keeping a young woman in servitude in her own home. You have withheld her identity, her inheritance, her name, and her history for 11 years. You have spent money that was not yours to spend, and you have been doing all of this while calling her a nobody and making her clean floors in front of your guests. He paused. I would like to know where the money went, Edward. I am going to find out regardless. The only question is whether you tell me now or whether you tell a judge in Louisville. The word judge landed in the room and did not leave. Edward looked at Greer. Greer looked back at him with the expression of a man who had made his choice and was not going to unmake it. Edward looked at Clara. She met his eyes and held them. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Land, Edward said finally. The word came out flat and exhausted the way words come out when a man is done fighting something. I invested in land, Western Territory. The investments failed. He stopped, swallowed. Most of them. Most, Nathaniel repeated. There's a parcel outside Nashville, still worth something. That parcel, Nathaniel said, will be part of the accounting that is presented to Miss Whitmore, along with everything else. He straightened. I think you understand the position you're in. I want to be certain you understand it completely, so there's no ambiguity between us. You are going to prepare a full and honest accounting of every asset, every expenditure, and every transaction associated with this estate for the last 11 years. You are going to do this willingly and completely because the alternative is a legal proceeding in which everything I've just described is presented to a court, and in Kentucky, in 1817, a court's view of a man who has defrauded an orphaned child of her inheritance is not going to be charitable. He paused just briefly. Am I clear? The silence stretched. Am I clear, Edward? Yes, Edward said. The word was barely sound, just the shape of it. Clara let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like 11 years. The documents went back into Greer's satchel, all except the birth record and her mother's letter. Those Greer slid gently across the table toward Clara, and she picked them up with hands that were careful and precise, and she held them. She looked down at her mother's handwriting. She is not nobody. She has never been nobody. She is mine. She thought I know. She thought I always knew somewhere. I always knew. She thought I just needed someone else to know it too. The door opened and then banged shut as Edward left the room, and the three of them, Clara, Nathaniel, Greer, sat in the quiet he left behind. After a moment, Greer looked at Clara. His face was old and tired and genuinely deeply sorry, and she looked at that sorrow, and she thought about what Hannah had told her, that trust is built one small thing at a time. I'm sorry, Greer said. I was a coward. I knew what was happening, and I told myself it was too complicated, that I didn't have enough evidence, that it wasn't my place. Those were lies I told myself because the truth was simpler and harder, which is that I was afraid. He held her gaze. I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry it was you who paid for my cowardice. Clara looked at him for a long moment. You're here now, she said. It wasn't forgiveness. She was not sure she was ready for forgiveness. Not sure she owed it on any particular schedule, not sure that absolution was the correct response to 11 years of someone else's fear. But she was a precise woman, and the precise thing was he was here now. That was true. She could say the true things and reserve the rest for when she had time to work through it properly. Greer nodded. He seemed to understand the distinction. He stood, picked up his satchel, and left the room quietly. Then it was just Clara and Nathaniel. The morning light had shifted, moving through the room at a different angle, and Clara realized with a small shock that it was nearly 11 o'clock, that the whole shape of her world had changed between breakfast and mid-morning, which seemed like it should have taken longer. She looked down at the birth record in her hands. Clara Evelyn Whitmore, she said aloud. It was the first time she had ever said her full name out loud. It felt strange in her mouth. Not wrong, not unfamiliar exactly, but new. The way things feel new when they've been yours all along, and you've simply never been permitted to hold them. "It suits you," Nathaniel said. She looked up. He was watching her with that expression consideration, not examination, and she studied his face for a moment and saw something there that she had been slowly becoming more able to read over the past few days. It was the expression of a man who had stopped performing and was simply present. "You knew before you came here," she said. Not an accusation, a realization. "I knew there was a Whitmore air. I didn't know it was you." He paused. I didn't know that the girl in the kitchen was her. I didn't know what I'd find when I walked in." "But you suspected." Greer described the situation. A child brought into the Hawthorne house around 1806, no family name given. It pointed somewhere. He looked at her steadily. "When I walked in and Edward called you a nobody, I didn't know then. But when you went to the child in the kitchen, when I watched that something felt wrong about the story I'd been given. Wrong in the direction of it's worse than I thought." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You said," she said slowly, "that I was the only person in the room acting like someone." "Yes." "Did you mean that—" "I don't say things I don't mean," he said. "It's a failing of mine, apparently. It makes dinners uncomfortable." She almost laughed. She hadn't expected that the small, dry humor coming through in a moment that was already so heavy with other things, and the almost laugh surprised her enough that she felt her face do something uncontrolled, something genuine, and she let it. Nathaniel looked at that expression on her face as if he was committing it to memory. She looked away. "What happens next?" She asked for the second time in 2 days. "Greer files the formal documentation in Louisville within the week. The bank in Lexington is notified. Edward has 60 days to produce the accounting. After that," he paused, "the estate returns to its legal owner." Clara let that sit. The estate returns to its legal owner. She had a legal name. She had documents. She had an estate. She had a solicitor who had come all the way from Louisville because a dying man's conscience had finally become louder than his fear. She had everything except the faintest idea of what to do with any of it. "I don't know how to be this," she said plainly. "I know how to be what I've been. I don't know how to be this." "I know," Nathaniel said. "I'm not asking you to fix it," she said quickly. "I'm just saying it. Because I've spent 17 years not being allowed to say true things, and I've decided I'm finished with that." "Good," he said. "Keep saying true things. They're harder to take away than most people think." She looked at him. He looked back. And then, because she was 17 years old and had just found out who she was, and her mother had loved her enough to write it in a letter and leave it in a satchel for 11 years, waiting for someone to be brave enough to use it, the tears came. Not the way she'd feared tears would come if she ever let them, not breaking, not crumbling, not the loss of everything she'd built to keep herself together. They came quietly, just two of them tracking down her face in the early November light, and she let them. Nathaniel did not say anything. He did not offer her a handkerchief. He did not look away or look too closely. He simply sat with her in the room while it happened, and his presence was the kind of presence that is steady without being a performance of steadiness, which was rarer than it should have been. After a moment, she pressed her fingers to her face. "I told myself I didn't cry," she said. "You should revise that," he said. "You cry when things are worth crying about. That's not a weakness. That's accuracy." She looked at him. She said, "Who are you, Nathaniel Caldwell?" He thought about it for a moment. "Someone who has been told," he said, "that I'm too particular, that I notice too much, that I ask too many questions." A pause. "I've recently become less bothered by that." She wiped her face. She sat up straight. She looked down at the birth record and the letter in her hands. "I need to think," she said. "I need some time to just think." "You have time," he said. "I need to be somewhere alone." "Of course." He stood. He moved toward the door. He stopped. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "Your mother was right," he said. "She is not nobody. She has never been nobody. He held her gaze. She just needed it put in front of enough people who could finally see it. He left. She sat alone in the room. She held her mother's letter in both hands, and she read it one more time. The careful, forward-leaning handwriting, the fear in it, and the love in it, and the fierce, clear, determined statement of a woman who had known what was coming and had refused to let it be the last word. She is mine. She is a Whitmore. And whatever happens, that is true. Clara folded the letter with great care and placed it against her chest. She sat there for a long time. And in the hallway outside, she could hear the sound of Edward Hawthorne pacing back and forth, the footsteps of a man trying to find a way out of a room that had no more doors. There were no more doors. She had closed them, not with anger, not with revenge, not with the particular satisfaction she had imagined sometimes in her most private and least controlled moments when she had let herself wonder what it would feel like to have power in this house. She had closed them simply by being found, by being exactly who she had always been in the same house she had always been in, and by having one man with serious eyes decide that what he saw was worth looking at more carefully. The whole of it, the birth record, the letter, the satchel full of evidence, the solicitor's confession, the full and terrible accounting of what had been done to her. All of it had been set in motion not by anything she had performed or demanded or fought for. It had been set in motion because Nathaniel Caldwell had watched her help a child with a cut hand and had decided that what he saw was worth a second look. She thought about that. She thought a single person seeing you clearly can change everything. She thought I have been seen. And the thing in her chest, the thing that had no name, that she had been folding and unfolding for 4 days, finally quietly, with the particular stillness of something that has found where it belongs, settled. She stood up. She put her mother's letter carefully in the pocket of her apron, close against her ribs. She walked to the window. Outside, the Kentucky hills were going amber and red in the late October morning, and the sky was the kind of blue that doesn't apologize for itself. Clara Evelyn Whitmore looked at the land that was hers. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned and went to find out what needed to be done next, and she walked through her own house like a woman who knew where she was going. The 60 days that followed moved both too slowly and too fast. Greer left for Louisville the morning after the confrontation, carrying his satchel and his 11 years of guilt and the particular lightened quality of a man who has finally set something down. He shook Clara's hand at the door formally with both hands, the way you shake the hand of someone you are acknowledging as an equal, and he said, "I will not fail you again, Miss Whitmore." And she believed him not because guilt was a reliable motivator, but because he was old and tired and had nothing left to protect, except the chance to do the right thing before he ran out of time to do it. Edward stayed. That surprised her. She had expected him to leave to disappear into the night with whatever he could carry, the way men who have been caught sometimes do, preferring distance to accountability. But Edward Hawthorne had lived in this county for 20 years, and his pride, it turned out, was more stubborn than his fear. He stayed in his rooms mostly. He came down for meals and said almost nothing, and looked at Clara with an expression she catalogued carefully, not remorse, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that might have been remorse if he'd had more practice at it. She did not avoid him. That was a choice she made deliberately, because avoiding him would have meant rearranging her movements around his presence, and she was done rearranging herself around Edward Hawthorne. She also did not speak to him unless spoken to. He tried once on the 4th day. She was in the library. Her library, she was still learning to think of it that way, going through the older ledgers that were now unlocked and available, and full of information. She was systematically working through with the same methodical patience she had applied to everything in her life. She heard him in the doorway before she saw him. She knew his footsteps, the way she knew everything about this house completely automatically, without having to think about it. She kept reading. "Clara, Miss Whitmore," she said without looking up. Her voice was entirely calm. "You may call me Miss Whitmore." A pause. "Miss Whitmore, then." His voice had the quality of a man working very hard at something that didn't come naturally. I think it's important that you understand. That you didn't mean it. She turned a page. That circumstances were difficult, that you did what you thought was necessary. She looked up, then finally, and held his gaze with the same steadiness she had been building for 17 years, which turned out to be very useful for exactly this kind of moment. I understand more than you think, Edward. I've had 11 years of close observation. She paused. What I don't have is any particular interest in hearing explanations right now. Maybe someday. Not today. He looked at her for a long moment. You're more like your father than I expected, he said, and there was something in it that was not a compliment, not an insult, just a fact. Observed reluctantly, given because he couldn't quite stop himself. Clara looked at him. Tell me about him, she said, and then before he could, no, not today, but someday you'll tell me, because you owe me that along with everything else. Edward nodded once and left. She looked back at the ledger. Her hands were not shaking. She was extremely tired of the fact that this continued to be something she had to note, but there it was. Nathaniel came every day. That was the part she hadn't anticipated, not the legal proceedings which Greer had outlined clearly enough that she'd known what to expect, and not the financial accounting which Edward produced with sullen compliance over the first 2 weeks. What she hadn't anticipated was Nathaniel. She hadn't anticipated that a man who had arrived as an agent of legal correction would stay and keep staying and find reasons to be present that had nothing to do with documents. He rode in from the inn in town each morning, which was a 4-mile ride, and she knew it was 4 miles because she had asked, and he had looked at her with that expression when she asked, and hadn't pretended the question wasn't what it was. He helped her learn the estate. Not condescendingly, he didn't explain things she already knew which she had braced herself for, because men who came to assist women in legal matters often seemed to feel that the assistance extended to explaining things the woman was perfectly capable of understanding herself. Nathaniel didn't do that. When he didn't know something, she did know he asked. When she didn't know something, he did know he told her plainly and without performance. They walked the boundaries of the property on the 6th day. It was cold. Properly cold now, November having arrived with its full intention, and they wore heavy coats and their breath made small clouds, and she asked questions about the western parcel and the land near the creek and the tenant arrangements, and he answered what he could and said, I don't know, cleanly when he didn't, which was something she noticed and filed away. How much do you know about running an estate? He asked her at one point. More than anyone gave me credit for, she said. Less than I'll need. She looked out over the property line. The accounts I can handle. The legal structure Greer is guiding me through. The tenant relationships that's going to take time. People have been dealing with Edward for 11 years. They have habits, expectations. Some of them are going to look at me and see a 17-year-old girl, and they're going to think that means something. It doesn't. I know that. They don't yet. She turned. That's the work, not the paperwork. The paperwork is just paperwork. The work is convincing 30 different men on 30 different parcels of land that the person standing in front of them knows what she's doing and intends to keep doing it. He looked at her. She looked back. You'll do it, he said. I know I will, she said. I'm not looking for reassurance. I'm thinking out loud. I know. The corner of his mouth moved. I'm not reassuring. I'm agreeing. She looked away before her face did something she wasn't ready for. They walked back in the cold, and she thought about the difference between being told you can do something and being told someone agrees with your own assessment that you can, and she thought the difference was larger than she'd realized, and she filed that away too. The formal transfer of the estate came in the 43rd day of the 60. Greer returned from Louisville with a Louisville judge named Harmon, who had the face of a man who had seen many things and been surprised by very few of them, and who looked at the assembled documents with the brisk efficiency of someone for whom this kind of legal reckoning, while not common, was not entirely without precedent. He met with Edward privately for 1 hour. Clara didn't know what passed between them in that hour, and she had decided she didn't need to. Whatever Edward said or didn't say, whatever accounting he gave of himself was between him and a judge, and whatever remained of his conscience, and none of those 3 parties required her presence. What required her presence was the signing. She sat at the long table in what had been Edward's formal sitting room, and was, as of the documents in front of her, becoming something else, and she signed her name 4 times. She signed it clearly, deliberately, each letter formed with the care of someone who had spent 17 years being told she didn't have one. Clara Evelyn Whitmore. Each time she wrote it, she felt something different, not more real, because it had always been real, but more visible, more confirmed, like tracing over something that had always been there and watching it emerge. Judge Harmon witnessed each signature. Greer witnessed. Nathaniel witnessed. And then it was done, and the estate was hers, and the judge shook her hand and said, "Miss Whitmore, this is a most unusual case, and I commend your composure throughout," which she thought was a very judge-like thing to say, and she thanked him sincerely. Edward left the following morning. He came down at first light with 2 trunks and his personal effects and the exhausted dignity of a man who had come to terms with a situation he had no remaining power to change. He stood in the front hall, and Clara stood there too, because this was her house, and she would stand in it however she chose. They looked at each other. "Where will you go?" she asked. He seemed surprised she'd asked. "Louisville, I expect. I have there our acquaintances." She nodded. She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced an envelope and held it out. He looked at it. "It's a letter," she said. "Of reference. It says you managed this estate for 11 years and that the grounds and the house are in good repair." She paused. "It doesn't say anything else. What it leaves out is its own kind of statement, but what it says is true." He stared at the envelope. "Why?" he said. "Because I need to be able to look at myself," she said plainly. "Not for your sake, for mine." She held it out another moment. "Take it, Edward. I'm not offering it twice." He took it. He left without another word. She heard the carriage pull away. She stood in the hall and let the sound of it go all the way to silence, and then she breathed. Hannah came out of the kitchen. "Well," Hannah said. "Well?" Clara agreed. "You all right, Clara dear?" She thought about it honestly because Hannah deserved honesty and always had. "I think," she said, "I will be." "That's enough," Hannah said. "That's more than enough for today." She went back to the kitchen. Clara stood in her hall. The house was quiet and entirely hers. Then came the social calls. She had expected difficulty. She had not quite anticipated the specific character of the difficulty, which was not hostility, not at first, but something that required more navigation than hostility did. Hostility you could address directly. What the county families offered her instead was a particular brand of careful courtesy that was almost indistinguishable from warmth if you didn't know what to look for, and that contained just underneath its polished surface the constant low-frequency message that they were reserving judgment, that they were waiting to see, that they had known her as one thing and were now being asked to see her as another, and they would do it when they were good and ready, and not a moment before. Mrs. Beaumont came in the 3rd week. She arrived with her daughter, a girl about Clara's age named Harriet, who had been at the party and had laughed along with everyone else, and she sat in Clara's parlor and drank Clara's tea and said all the right things about what a remarkable situation it was. What a surprise, how pleased everyone was that the matter had been resolved correctly. Clara sat across from her and listened. She waited for the thing underneath the thing. It came as Mrs. Beaumont was on her 2nd cup. "Of course," she said with the particular lightness that precedes something heavy. "It must be a great deal to adjust to, the change in circumstances, after so many years of well." She smiled. "One hopes you'll have good guidance." Clara set her own cup down. She had practiced this. Not the specific conversation, she couldn't have predicted Mrs. Beaumont specifically, but the general shape of it. She had practiced it in the quiet of her own rooms at night, when the estate was hers, and the dark was hers, and she could be as uncertain as she actually was without anyone seeing. "Mrs. Beaumont," she said with a warmth that was not performed but was chosen. She chose warmth the way she chose everything. Now deliberately. "I've been managing the household accounts of this estate for 2 years. I've been observing its operations for 11. I understand its legal structure. its tenant arrangements, and its financial position more thoroughly than most men manage to understand their own. She picked her cup back up. I appreciate the concern, but I find I have a great deal less adjusting to do than people seem to expect. Mrs. Beaumont blinked. Harriet, who had been sitting very still, made a small sound that might have been suppressed laughter. Well, said Mrs. Beaumont. More tea? Clara offered. The visit ended 20 minutes later, and Clara judged it a qualified success. Nathaniel was waiting on the porch. He'd been helping one of the tenant farmers sort a fence dispute and had arrived back just as the Beaumont carriage pulled away, and he looked at her face when she came out and said, "How bad?" "Not bad," she said. "Educational." She sat down on the porch steps, which she did now because it was her porch and her steps. She expected me to be grateful for the attention, to be still behaving like someone who understood that her presence required justification. And I was polite, Clara said, and I was absolutely clear, and I think she'll go home and tell everyone that the Whitmore girl is not what they were expecting, and I think that's the right outcome. Nathaniel leaned against the porch post. He had the late afternoon sun behind him and his coat on, and the comfortable ease of a man who had been outdoors all day and didn't mind it. "You're good at this," he said. "I've been practicing being invisible for 17 years, she said. "It turns out the skills transfer. The difference is just what you're trying to be." He was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "You always do," she said. "What do you want? Not what needs to happen next, not what the estate requires, not what society expects from you. What do you actually want?" She looked out at the land. It was the question she'd been avoiding. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer felt large. Larger than she was used to the things she wanted being. For 17 years, she had practiced wanting small things, safe things, things that couldn't be taken away because they were too slight to bother taking. She had gotten very good at calibrating her wants to the size of what she was permitted. She was still learning to want at full size. "I want people to have what I didn't have," she said. "Children who don't know who they are. Women who don't have anywhere to go. People who've been told they're nobody for so long they've started to believe it." She paused. "This estate is large. It's larger than one person needs." Another pause. "I think I want to do something with the parts that are larger than I need." Nathaniel was very still. "I think you should," he said, quietly. She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me to establish myself first, secure the property, build the social standing before I do anything that might make people uncomfortable. I'm sure there are people who would give you that advice. You're not one of them. I watched you choose to help a child with a cut hand," he said, "instead of responding to a room full of people who were laughing at you. That wasn't strategy. That was character." He met her eyes. "I don't think you need to wait until other people are ready before you act like yourself." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The late afternoon was very still around them. She thought, "This man has seen me more clearly in 3 weeks than anyone has seen me in 17 years. She thought that is either the most natural thing in the world or the most frightening. She thought very quietly that it might be both. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes. Why are you still here?" She meant it plainly, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as the question it was. He'd accomplished what he'd come to do. The legal matter was resolved. His bank had its answers. Greer had his absolution. There was no professional reason for him to be riding 4 miles every morning to sit in her library and walk her fences and wait on her porch. He looked at her with an expression she could read now. She had been learning to read it over 3 weeks, and she could read it clearly. "I think you know why," he said. She did know. She had known for at least 10 days. Knowing hadn't made it simpler, but it had made it more present, like a fire in a room. You could look at other things, but the warmth was always there at the edge of your awareness. "This is not a simple situation," she said. "I know. I've just received an estate and a name and a history and a set of social obligations I'm still sorting through. I am 17 years old. I don't know what I'm doing half the time." "You know what you're doing significantly more than half the time," he said. "I've been paying attention. Nathaniel, "I'm not asking anything of you," he said, and his voice was careful and genuine. I'd like permission to keep being here, for whatever that's worth to you, at whatever pace makes sense to you." He paused. "I know what I feel. I'm not in a hurry for you to feel anything about it. I'm just asking to be in the vicinity while you figure out what you're doing." She looked at him. He looked back. "The vicinity," she said. "The vicinity," he confirmed. The corner of her mouth moved before she could stop it. "You are an unusual man, Nathaniel Caldwell," she said. "I've been told that," he said. "I've recently decided it's a compliment." She stood from the step. She brushed her skirt straight. She looked out at the amber evening settling over her land. "You may," she said, "remain in the vicinity." She went inside. She heard behind her the quiet sound of a man who had just released a breath he had been holding for a while. She allowed herself to smile where no one could see it. Then she went to her desk, and she wrote the first letter in a series of letters to the county school board, to a women's society in Louisville she had learned about from Greer, to 2 former tenant farmers who had written to express their relief at the change in management and whose letters had given her an idea. She wrote for 2 hours. She wrote with the forward-leaning hand she had discovered she shared with her mother, and she wrote about things she wanted to build carefully, one sentence at a time. She thought about what Hannah had said. Trust is built one small thing at a time. She was beginning to understand that the same was true of everything worth having. An estate was built one decision at a time. A reputation was built one honest conversation at a time. A life was built one day at a time, one choice at a time, one small refusal to be invisible at a time. She had been building this life for 17 years without knowing she was doing it. She was going to keep building it now with her name on it, with her mother's eyes open in her face, with the letter in her pocket against her ribs like a second heartbeat. It was late when she finally stopped writing. The candles had burned low, the house had gone quiet, and she sat back in her chair and let the silence of the place settle around her. She thought about Edward's footsteps, which used to pace these halls, and how their absence changed the sound of the house not emptier but cleaner. More itself. She thought about her mother, who had been afraid, who had been right to be afraid, who had loved her enough to leave evidence. She thought about Nathaniel. In the vicinity. 4 miles away in town, probably asleep. Probably thinking about fence lines and ledgers, or possibly not. She thought about a man who had looked at her in a room full of laughter and decided she was worth looking at more carefully. She thought about what Hannah had said. It ain't a cruel look, and she thought that Hannah was more right than she'd known how to express. She thought a single person seeing you clearly can change everything. She had been seen. And now she was here in her house at her desk, writing letters about the things she wanted to build. And for the first time, for the absolute first time in 17 years, she went to bed. Not because the day's work was done and she had no other option, but because she had chosen to rest. Because tomorrow had things in it she was genuinely looking forward to, because the future was a place she was beginning cautiously and with her full attention to want to move toward. She put her mother's letter under her pillow. She closed her eyes. She slept. Spring came to Harlan County the way it always did, without asking permission, without announcing itself, simply arriving one morning and being undeniably present. Clara noticed it the way she noticed everything, which was completely and without ceremony. She was at her desk by 5:30, which was a habit she had kept from her years of early kitchen fires, except now the desk was hers, and the papers on it were hers, and the decisions she was making at that hour were consequential in a way that setting a fire had never been. She had a meeting with the county school board at 9. She had a letter to finish for the Women's Society in Louisville. She had tenant John Marsh coming at 11 about the eastern fence line, and she needed to have read through the original property survey before he arrived, because Marsh was the kind of man who would test her on the details, not out of malice, but out of habit. The way men who had dealt with Edward Hawthorne for years had developed a habit of testing. She had learned over the past 4 months to be ready for the testing. She finished the letter, reviewed the survey, and was pulling on her coat when Hannah appeared in the doorway of the study with a cup of coffee and an expression that meant she had something to say. Mrs. Delacourt sent a note, Hannah said. Early this morning. Her girl brought it. Clara took the coffee. What does it say? It says she hopes you'll reconsider attending the spring gathering at their estate next month. Hannah paused. It's the third invitation. I know. You've declined twice. I know that too. Hannah looked at her steadily. You planning to decline a third time? Clara drank her coffee. She thought about Mrs. Delacourt's spring gathering, which was the largest social event in the county, which she had been invited to as a servant, and had attended as a servant 4 times, carrying trays and keeping her eyes down, and which she was now being invited to as Miss Whitmore of Whitmore Estate. She thought about the specific difficulty of walking into a room full of people who remembered both versions of you and had to reconcile them, and how much easier it would be to simply not do that. She thought about her mother's letter, which she still carried, which had become so familiar against her ribs that she noticed when it wasn't there. She thought about a woman who had been afraid and had refused to let the fear be the last word. No, she said. I'll go. Hannah nodded once with satisfaction. Good. Don't look pleased with yourself. I'm always pleased with myself, Hannah said. It's one of my better qualities. Clara finished her coffee and went to meet the school board. There were 4 of them, men in their 40s and 50s, solid county men, with property and opinions, and the particular wariness of people being asked to change something they'd been doing a certain way for a long time. They sat across the library table from her, and they were polite, carefully polite, and she could feel underneath the politeness the assessment happening in real time. She had prepared for this meeting for 2 weeks, not because she was uncertain of what she wanted. She had been certain of that since the night she'd written her first letters 4 months ago, but because certainty without preparation was just stubbornness, and she intended to be effective, not just right. She laid out her proposal clearly. A school on the eastern portion of the Whitmore property accessible to children whose families couldn't afford the county schoolhouse fees. A teacher's salary she would fund for the first 2 years, after which she proposed a shared county arrangement. A curriculum that didn't distinguish between what boys needed to learn and what girls needed to learn, because in her experience, the people who'd told her what a girl needed to know had been wrong about most of it. That last point landed with a particular weight in the room. One of the men, a Mr. Patterson with large hands and a careful expression, said, Miss Whitmore, I wonder if you might be ambitious in your scope. This is a considerable undertaking for someone my age, she said pleasantly. He shifted. I was going to say, for a first venture. I appreciate the concern, she said. I've found that the best response to a first venture is to make it succeed, which I intend to do. She looked at each of them in turn. Gentlemen, I'm not asking you to fund anything. I'm asking you to allow it. The land is mine. The salary is mine to offer. What I need from you is your formal recognition so that this school has standing in the county and the children who attend it are treated as properly educated. She paused. I would think that costs you very little and benefits the county considerably. The 4 men exchanged looks. Mr. Patterson said, We'll need to discuss it. Of course, she said. I'll expect your answer by Friday. She stood. They stood reflexively. She had noticed that happening, this reflexive response to her manner. Men who had spent decades being deferred to suddenly being in rooms where the direction of deference had shifted, and their bodies responding before their minds quite caught up. She found it interesting. She did not find it amusing because it was too serious for that, but she found it interesting. She showed them out herself. Nathaniel was in the hall. He had taken to arriving mid-morning, on days she had formal meetings not to attend them, but to be available afterward for whatever analysis or debriefing or simple unburdening she needed. She had stopped pretending this was merely collegial approximately 6 weeks ago. He looked at her face. How did it go? They'll say yes, she said. Patterson will argue for another week because that's his nature, but they'll say yes. She moved toward the stairs. John Marsh is in 20 minutes. Walk with me while I think. He fell into step beside her without comment, which was one of the things she had come to value about him. his ability to be present without requiring her to manage his presence. "Tell me something," she said as they moved through the hall. "What do you need to know?" Marsh. He was Edward's man, essentially. He was loyal because Edward let him manage the western pasture on easy terms. That arrangement is going to have to change. The terms aren't sustainable for the estate, and he knows it's coming. She was thinking out loud, which she did with Nathaniel now, freely, because he had proven over 4 months that thinking out loud in his presence was safe. How do I do this without losing him? He knows that land better than anyone. Nathaniel thought for a moment. Don't change the terms immediately. Change the structure. Give him a formal role land manager, something with a title that reflects what he actually does, and adjust the terms as part of that formalization. Men like Marsh respond better to expansion than reduction, even when the net effect is similar. Clara considered this. That's good. You would have gotten there yourself. Yes, but you saved me the time. He smiled. She saw it and looked away. John Marsh arrived exactly on time, which told her something. Men who wanted to establish dominance arrived late, and men who had already decided to comply arrived early. Men who came on time were negotiating. She respected that. She made sure he knew she respected it, which she did by knowing every number in the survey by heart, and speaking to him as one person who understood land to another. And by the end of the hour, he had agreed to a formal land management role, with a salary that was slightly better than his previous arrangement in ways that mattered to him, and slightly different in ways that mattered to the estate, and he left looking like a man who had come in braced for a fight, and was pleasantly confused to have gotten a fair deal instead. "Well," Nathaniel said from the doorway where he'd observed the last 10 minutes. "Don't," she said. "I was only going to say. You were going to say something complimentary, and I'm going to tell you to stop because I don't need it and it makes me self-conscious." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it actually make you self-conscious, or have you simply decided that accepting compliments is a vulnerability?" She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at him. "That's an unfair question." "It's a fair question. You're just not used to fair questions about your interior life." She turned back to the papers on her desk and made a note she didn't entirely need to make. "Both," she said after a moment. "It's both." He said nothing, which was the correct response, and the one she'd expected from him, and she was aware in the quiet that followed of how precisely calibrated his silences had become to her. How well he had learned the difference between the silences she needed him to fill and the silences she needed him to simply hold with her. That evening, she wrote to the Women's Society in Louisville with a proposal for a residential program somewhere women without resources or family could come for 3 to 6 months and receive training in accounts, in reading, in practical skills that would allow them to support themselves without requiring a husband or a patron. She had been thinking about this since November. It was the most ambitious thing she had attempted yet, and she was aware that it was ambitious, aware that it would meet resistance, aware that there would be people in this county and the next who found it actively objectionable. She sent the letter anyway. She thought my mother wrote a letter when she was afraid, because not writing it would have meant letting the fear win. She was her mother's daughter. She sent the letter. The response from Louisville came in 2 weeks. The society's director, a woman named Cornelia Ashworth, who wrote with the brisk, intelligent economy of someone who had spent 30 years turning limited resources into significant outcomes, said yes. Not just yes. She said she had been waiting for someone with land and means to propose exactly this thing, and could they meet in Louisville in the spring, and would Miss Whitmore be prepared to be named a founding supporter of the expanded program. Clara read the letter 3 times. Then she went and found Hannah and read it to her out loud. Hannah sat down in the kitchen chair and pressed her hands over her face and made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, and was entirely Hannah. "Clara, dear," she said finally. "I know," Clara said. "Your mama would—" "I know," Clara said more quietly. They sat together in the kitchen for a long time without saying anything else, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and Clara held her mother's name inside her chest and felt it warm. The spring gathering at the Delacourt estate arrived on a Thursday in late April. Clara wore blue. She had deliberated about this, had considered wearing something more subdued, something that would attract less attention, and had then recognized that train of thought as a very old habit from a life she was no longer living, and had chosen blue. Deliberately, a deep, clear blue that had been her mother's favorite color, according to something Hannah had mentioned once, and that Clara had stored carefully and not forgotten. She arrived in her own carriage, which was a thing she still had not entirely gotten used to. She had her own carriage, and her own driver, and her own name on the estate register, and she was still 4 months in, occasionally surprised by these facts in quiet moments when she wasn't bracing herself for anything. She walked into the Delacourt parlor, and the room, large, full, bright with spring evening light, shifted. She felt it. The specific quality of a room's attention reorganizing itself. People turning, registering, reassessing. She had walked into this kind of room as a servant, and felt the assessment, and been found wanting. She was walking into it now as Clara Evelyn Whitmore, and the assessment was the same human machinery, doing the same thing, and she met it with the same face she had built over 17 years, except that it wasn't armor anymore. It was simply her face. Mrs. Beaumont reached her first. "Miss Whitmore, how wonderful that you could come." "Mrs. Beaumont, thank you for the kind welcome." "You look remarkably well." "I feel remarkably well," Clara said. "Thank you." Mrs. Beaumont's daughter Harriet appeared at her mother's elbow. She looked at Clara with an expression that was direct and not unkind. "I owe you an apology," Harriet said. "From October. I laughed when I should not have, and I've thought about it since." Clara looked at her. She was aware that this was a moment that could go in several directions, and she chose the direction deliberately. "Thank you for saying so," she said. "That took something." Harriet looked slightly surprised, as if she'd expected the conversation to be harder. Yes, well," she paused. "I think what you're doing with the school is extraordinary." News traveled fast in a county this size. Clara had counted on that. "Come and see it when it opens," Clara said. "In September if everything goes to plan." "I'd like that," Harriet said. And she meant it. Clara could tell the difference. She moved through the room. She spoke to the men from the school board, to the tenant farmers who had come as guests rather than workers, to 3 women who pulled her aside near the window and asked in low, earnest voices about the residential program, whether it was real, whether it would truly take women with nothing, and she said yes. And the yes landed in their faces like something they hadn't allowed themselves to want until they heard that it was possible. One of them, a woman maybe 40, with work-roughened hands that she'd tried to hide and couldn't quite, said, "My sister. She's got nowhere. Her husband," and stopped. Clara took her hand. "Write to me," she said. "Write to me this week. We'll see what we can do." The woman nodded, pressing her lips together. Clara moved on. She was near the far end of the room, taking a breath between conversations when she heard it. 2 men nearby, not quite lowering their voices enough. Remarkable, really, given where she came from. Hawthorne had her carrying trays for a decade. Wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen the documents myself. And then the third voice, which she recognized as Mr. Patterson from the school board, who said, "She didn't come from nowhere Aldridge. She came from the Whitmore family, which is one of the oldest in this county. The only thing remarkable about it is that it took this long for anyone to notice." Clara did not turn around, but she felt something in her chest move, the same thing that had been moving since October. The thing that had no name, and this time it settled with a completeness she hadn't felt before. Not triumph, not vindication exactly. Something quieter and more permanent. Something that felt like, yes, that. She found Nathaniel near the door an hour later. He looked at her face and said nothing, because he could read her face now the way she could read his, which had happened somewhere around the 2nd month without either of them formally acknowledging it. "Ready to go," he said. Almost. She looked back at the room, at the people she had served, at the families she had watched, at the county she had lived in for 17 years as nothing and was now navigating as something. "I want to remember it," she said. "The difference between tonight and October. I want to keep it." Why? She thought about it. Because forgetting what something cost is how you stop valuing what it bought. He was quiet. Then, that's true. I know it is. She turned. Now I'm ready. They drove back to Whitmore Estate in the spring evening, the carriage moving through the dark, and the smell of new growth, and they talked about the school, and Cornelia Ashworth and John Marsh, and the letter Clara had received from the county records office about her father's history, which she was still sorting through, still learning, still building the picture of a man she had never known, who had apparently been principled and exacting and somewhat solitary qualities. She recognized in herself with a shock of recognition she returned to regularly. He kept detailed journals, she said. Greer found them in storage, 20 years of journals. She paused. I've been reading them at night. He wrote about the land the way I think about the accounts, like everything was connected, like you could trace anything back to its source if you were patient enough. He sounds like you, Nathaniel said. I think I sound like him, she corrected. He smiled. She saw it in the dark. The carriage stopped. She moved to get out, and he was there before the driver, which she had stopped arguing with 6 weeks ago, because the argument was one she kept losing. Not because she was wrong, but because there was something in the gesture that she had begun quietly, and without announcing it, to let herself want. She stepped down. He didn't step back as far as protocol required, which meant they were closer than was entirely proper for the front step of her house with the carriage driver present, and she was aware of this and chose not to address it. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. The spring night was quiet around them, and the estate was lit in the windows, and it was hers. All of it, the land and the light, and the name above the door, and she was here standing in it, and beside her was a man who had seen her carrying a tray in a house that was already hers, and had decided she was worth looking at more carefully. Nathaniel, she said. Yes. I've been thinking. She paused. I've been thinking about what you said in October, about being in the vicinity. I remember. You've been in the vicinity for 6 months. I have. I've decided, she said carefully with the precision she brought to everything that mattered, that I'm no longer interested in the vicinity. A beat. What are you interested in? His voice was very quiet. She held his gaze. Something less provisional. He was still for a moment. Then, Clara. Yes. I have been trying very hard for 6 months not to say the things I want to say before you were ready to hear them. I know. I'm not entirely certain I can continue that effort. I'm not asking you to, she said. He breathed. It was the second time she had heard him release a held breath in her presence, and she thought she would not tire of that, of being the person who made Nathaniel Caldwell, who was composed and precise and carried everything internally, let something go. I did not fall in love with your name, he said. I need you to know that. I didn't fall in love with the estate, or with the version of you that the world was beginning to see in October, or with the person you're becoming. I fell in love with the woman who is already here, who helped a child with a cut hand instead of defending herself to a room full of people laughing at her. Who showed me numbers that told the truth when showing me those numbers was the most dangerous thing she could have done. Who cried twice in front of me and was furious with herself both times for reasons that had nothing to do with weakness. He paused. I fell in love with you when you had nothing. I need that to be clear. Clara looked at him for a long moment. It's clear, she said. And... She reached out and took his hand. Her hands were steady, which she was aware of, and she thought some things you stop having to be proud of eventually, because they stop costing you anything. And yes, she said. He looked at their hands, then at her face. Yes, he repeated. Don't make me say it more times than that, she said. I said what I meant. He laughed. It was not a performed laugh. It was a genuine one. Surprised and warm, and she had not heard that from him before, and she stored it the way she stored everything important. All right, he said. All right, she said. She went inside. She stood in her hall, her coat still on, and she let herself feel the evening in its entirety. The room at the Delacourts, the woman with the work-roughened hands. Patterson's voice saying she came from the Whitmore family. Nathaniel's hand in hers on the front step, the spring dark all around the estate that was hers. She thought about October, about carrying a tray and a patched dress and lowering her eyes and folding herself small enough that people would forget to keep looking. She thought about the morning after the party when she had stood in the kitchen and understood that she was not going to fold herself small anymore, not because folding was no longer available to her, but because she had decided to stop. That decision, that single quiet, privately made decision, had been the beginning of everything. Not Nathaniel arriving, not Greer and his satchel and his overdue conscience, not the documents or the name or the estate. The beginning had been her, standing in her kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, bread dough under her hands, deciding. She took off her coat. She hung it on the hook that she had put at exactly the right height for her because everything in this house was hers now, and she could put hooks where she needed them. She walked through the hall, and she was aware of each room. She passed the library with its unlocked cabinets, the formal parlor where she had met the school board, the sitting room where she had poured tea for Mrs. Beaumont and been deliberately clear, and she thought all of this was always mine. She went to her desk. She had 3 letters to write before bed. She had a meeting at 8 the next morning. She had a school to build, and a program to found, and a property to manage, and a father's journals to read, and a history to learn, and a future that was for the first time something she was moving toward instead of simply enduring. She picked up her pen. She thought about what she would say many years from now if someone asked her what it had felt like to be nobody and then to be found. She thought she would say, "I was never nobody. I was just waiting for the world to catch up with what I already knew." She thought she would say a name can be stolen. A fortune can disappear. But the person you truly are cannot be taken away, not by 11 years, not by a room full of people laughing, not by anyone who calls you nothing, because they do not have that power. They never had it. You simply believed for a while that they did. She thought she would say, "The moment I stopped believing it, everything changed." And outside the Kentucky spring continued without ceremony, and the estate was lit and quiet, and somewhere 4 miles away, a man with serious eyes was riding back toward town with her. Yes, still warm in his chest. And Clara Evelyn Whitmore sat at her desk in her house on her land with her mother's name and her father's precision and her own 17 years of endurance and survival and quiet, stubborn, undefeated selfhood. And she wrote. She wrote because she had things to say. She wrote because her voice was hers. She wrote because nobody, not a single soul in Harlan County or Louisville or anywhere else in the state of Kentucky in the year of 1818 would ever again be able to say that name and mean nothing. Clara Whitmore had arrived. She had in truth been here all along.